Welcome back to the deep dive. You've given us the sources, and we are here to give you the signal, the clearest, most impactful takeaways you need to understand the world's most complex moments fast. Today we are deep diving into a historical event that, quite frankly, shouldn't have happened. Not according to the standard history books of the time, anyway.
Not at all.
We're talking about an African nation in the late 19th century successfully repelling a major European military power.
And right in the middle of the so-called scramble for Africa.
Exactly. This moment just fundamentally shattered that myth of colonial invincibility. Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into the pivotal Battle of Adwa.
And we really need to emphasize that geopolitical context for you. By 1896, Europe had systematically divided up almost 90% of the African continent.
Wow, 90%.
Yeah. Treaties were being signed, borders drawn on maps in Berlin, and the general assumption was that no indigenous state could possibly withstand modern European arms. It just wasn't seen as a possibility. So the Battle of Adwa, fought on March 1st, 1896 in Ethiopia, is this monumental contradiction to that whole narrative.
It's the exception that proves the rule is wrong.
Exactly. It was the first major defeat of a colonial power, in this case, Italy, by African troops. And this victory, it preserved Ethiopia's ancient sovereignty when, literally every other major state around it was collapsing into a colony or a protectorate.
That sets the stakes perfectly. This wasn't just a win, this was existential. So let's establish the scene of the conflict. The battle was fought near the town of Adwa, that's in the rugged, mountainous northern part of Ethiopia.
A difficult terrain.
Very. And this was the decisive and, terminal engagement of the First Italo-Ethiopian War. On one side, you had the invading Italian army, led by General Oreste Barstieri. And they had marched inland, very confident, expecting, an easy victory.
Add another jewel to the new Italian Empire?
Precisely. And facing them was the unified Ethiopian army, commanded by the formidable Emperor Menelik II.
And what's so fascinating here is that Menelik hadn't just relied on traditional forces. He had spent years consolidating power and, crucially, using diplomatic channels to get modern weaponry.
Right. From who?
From European rivals like France and Russia, who were actually quite keen to see Italy falter a bit. So he got rifles, artillery. This was not a spear and shield battle.
Okay, so if we connect this to the bigger picture, the outcome just fundamentally changed the trajectory of colonial history in Africa.
It did.
It specifically injected doubt and maybe even hope, where before there had only been this sense of resignation. This was the signal anti-colonial movements have been waiting for.
That Europeans bleed, just like everyone else.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the incredible mobilization on the Ethiopian side, because the numbers themselves, they just tell half the story.
The scale is staggering.
It really is. Emperor Menelik II commanded this massive national force. It was disciplined, gathered from every corner of his empire, and it numbered around 100,000 troops.
100,000. Let that sink in. The logistical effort alone.
Immense. Which is why we need to talk about the role of Empress Taytu Betul.
Oh, absolutely. We have to highlight her role. It wasn't just supportive, it was foundational. She was a political and military strategist in her own right, not just a figurehead.
So what does she do specifically?
Well, the sources show she was instrumental in securing the loyalty of regional governors, and she made sure the supplies, food, water, ammunition made it across hundreds of miles of that difficult territory to sustain that army.
So she was the logistical backbone.
She was the entire logistical backbone of the operation. A massive feat of national coordination.
Yeah, it's the depth we look for. It wasn't just Menelik's charisma, it was this comprehensive national mobilization, supported by sophisticated leadership like Empress Taytu. Now, contrast that. An impressive figure of 100,000 highly motivated Ethiopian forces. And what did the invading army have? General Baratieri commanded only about, 15,000 to 20,000 soldiers?
That's right. And that included Italian regulars, but also colonial units, primarily Eritrean askari.
So that immediately raises a question for me. If Menelik had 100,000, why didn't Italy just retreat? Why not wait for reinforcements?
Was it an intelligence failure, or was it pure colonial hubris?
And it was a disastrous combination of both, right? They knew they were outnumbered, roughly 5-1, but the Italians were just supremely confident.
Totally. They believed their technological superiority. The modern artillery, the rapid-fire rifles would just carry the day.
They expected the Ethiopians to scatter after the first few volleys.
They gambled on quality over what they saw as just. overwhelming, uncoordinated quantity. They were blinded by the belief that Africans simply couldn't coordinate a force of that magnitude.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because that sheer scale, that 5-to-1 advantage, it didn't just matter in the total count. It changed Baratieri's entire tactical calculus.
Right. He knew he couldn't face them head on. Not really. He needed a knockout blow.
The surprise.
Precisely. He decided on this high-risk, high-reward strategy. A surprise attack, launched under the cover of darkness. The plan was to move his small force through that extremely rugged, mountainous terrain near Adwa.
And get the high ground.
And establish forward positions on high ground before dawn, catching the Ethiopians completely off guard.
A good plan in theory, maybe, but a nightmare in practice, especially with limited visibility and, limited resources. So what was the fatal flaw in the execution?
The fatal flaw was division and a total lack of coordination. To cover the ground and try to flank that massive Ethiopian encampment, Baratieri divided his already limited force.
He split them up.
He split them into 4 isolated columns. He was relying on them maintaining strict discipline, radio silence while navigating these treacherous mountain passes.
All while hoping the enemy, who knows the land like the back of their hand, wouldn't spot them.
It was a recipe for disaster. And unsurprisingly, given the conditions, the steep ravines, the winding paths, the darkness, they lost coordination almost immediately.
So the columns just got separated.
Totally separated. They took wrong turns. They ended up strung out all across the battlefield. One column, I think it was the first one to move, even misread a map and stopped miles short of its intended defensive position.
So that disorganization, it turns a bad tactical situation into a complete catastrophe.
Yeah.
Menelik II, who had been waiting patiently for the Italians to make a mistake,
Didn't have to face a unified, technologically superior army.
instead he got to fight them piecemeal.
Exactly. The Ethiopian forces were able to launch a series of coordinated assaults against these isolated Italian brigades, just overwhelming them one by one.
With sheer weight and focused firepower.
And the Ethiopian soldiers, using their deep knowledge of the terrain, they could maneuver rapidly. They were just enveloping these smaller, stranded Italian units.
They quickly overwhelmed the Italian artillery, the forward positions, before they could even really deploy properly. Our sources describe what happened next as just a chaotic rout.
It wasn't even a retreat.
No. And the most shocking detail, one entire Italian brigade was completely annihilated. Wiped out.
Wiped out entirely. I mean, that is the stark definition of a tactical disaster. It was a
The
disintegration.
loss was absolute. And the casualty reports that went back to Europe, they sent shockwaves. When you quantify the cost of this, the numbers for the Italians are just stunning.
The suffering was immense. Italy lost over 6,000 men killed in total.
Out of an army of, 20,000?
Exactly. To break it down, you had 2,918 non-commissioned officers and men from the main Italian units, plus big losses among the Eritrean colonial troops. And crucially, from a command perspective, 2 Italian generals were killed in action.
2 generals.
And that's not even counting the captured. Another 3,800 soldiers were captured, thousands more were wounded, for an invasion force of around 18,000, losing over 10,000 killed or captured in a single day.
That's a loss rate that is almost unthinkable.
It's a complete destruction of their military capacity in the region.
And while Ethiopia was victorious, we have to acknowledge the ferocity of the defense. I mean, this was not a lopsided slaughter. The Italians fought hard.
They did, which resulted in substantial losses for Menelik's army as well.
Right. Ethiopia, out of its much larger force, endured between 4,000 and 7,000 killed.
And up to 10,000 wounded.
So the sources make it clear, right? While the victory secured their future, it came at a very high, very bloody price. It just confirms the desperate nature of the fighting on both sides. So what does this all mean? Beyond the immediate bloodshed, this decisive Ethiopian victory created instant, massive political and diplomatic repercussions in Europe, especially back in Rome.
Oh, the immediate consequence was just pure humiliation and political upheaval. General Baratieri was immediately relieved of command, arrested, and later court-martialed back in Italy.
Was he convicted?
No, he was ultimately acquitted due to political pressure, but his career was over. The defeat forced the government to capitulate, and that prompted the signing of the Treaty of Addis Ababa later that year.
And this treaty was seismic, wasn't it?
It was. It had 2 major lasting effects. First, it formally and internationally recognized Ethiopian sovereignty. Without any ambiguity, Italy had to abandon its claims, just swallow that national humiliation.
And the second effect,
It ensured that Italian expansion in the region was completely halted, stopped dead in its tracks.
That halt is the key takeaway for you, the listener. This single military disaster forced a pause on imperial ambition that lasted for 4 long decades.
Specifically until 1935.
Right. And that year, of course, marks Mussolini's renewed fascist-era attempt to conquer the region. So the ultimate knowledge nugget here is clarity. Adwa proved that African independence was achievable through modern military and diplomatic organization. The keys were a large, well-equipped, disciplined African force under unified leadership.
Superior coordination, knowledge of the terrain.
And the failed tactical mistake by the Italian command of dividing its smaller invading army.
The story of Adwa is just a masterpiece of military planning and adaptation, but that 40-year consequence is what really gives it its power. So consider this as you go through your day. The Treaty of Addis Ababa didn't just end one war, it acted as a political and military force field for 4 decades. How did this single decisive military victory in 1896 influence the Italian political appetite for Ethiopia so profoundly that it kept them away until fascist Italy in 1935? What does it take for one massive defeat to enforce sovereignty for 40 years? That's something to mull over.
If you're looking to get instantly well-informed on a topic, but you don't want to wade through dense academic journals or dusty military reports, then you are definitely in the right place. Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Today we're focusing our attention on one of the most, well, frankly, one of the most stunning military upsets of the entire 19th century. We're talking about the Battle of Adwa in 1896.
Right. This was the moment when Italy, this emerging European colonial power, was just absolutely crushed by the Ethiopian Empire.
And crushed is the right word. It wasn't a narrow defeat. It was a complete strategic failure that sent shockwaves through Europe.
And that's our mission today. We're going to dive into the sources that detail exactly why. Why did Italy, with its presumed technological edge, its modern army, suffer this colossal loss? We're going to pull out the key nuggets that really pinpoint the strategic mistakes and, maybe even more importantly, the intelligence failures.
It was a perfect storm, really, and this deep dive is so crucial because Adwa wasn't just another colonial skirmish, it was a landmark event. It fundamentally redefined how the world saw African resistance and, colonial conquest itself.
It's like a huge warning sign that Italy, and maybe all of Europe, just completely failed to read.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we have to start right at the heart of it, the moment of, well, what you could call operational suicide, the battle plan.
The man in charge, General Oreste Baratieri, he makes a decision that, looking back, it almost defies military common sense, especially given what he knew or should have known about his own logistical situation.
And what was that core decision?
It was a massive gamble. He ordered a complex, coordinated nighttime advance. This wasn't supposed to be a simple frontal assault. The idea that the doctrine behind it was a surprise flanking maneuver, a trap.
A trap? And to spring this trap, he commits his entire force. We're talking about, what, 14,500, maybe 15,000 men marching in the dark?
Yes, his whole army. But the fatal flaw wasn't just the darkness, it was how he split them up.
Right. This is where it gets really crazy.
He divided his force into 4 completely separate, totally isolated brigades. The entire plan, everything, hinged on these 4 columns moving in perfect sync.
In the dark.
In the dark. Across unmapped, brutal, mountainous terrain. I mean, you have to picture this. Jagged ridges, deep ravines, probably pockets of mist and fog.
So trying to move 15,000 men like that, even today with GPS and night vision, would be a nightmare.
It's almost unthinkable. And the goal required them to be separate. The plan, conceptually, was clever in a way. The 4 brigades were meant to arrive at different points at the exact same time, at dawn, and converge on the Ethiopian positions.
Creating a deadly crossfire.
A crossfire trap, exactly. But the reality of the darkness in that terrain meant that the whole idea of coordination it evaporated. I mean, long before they even made contact with the enemy, they were already lost.
So the terrain itself basically became the 5th column fighting for the Ethiopians.
It did.
It still begs the question, though. How could Baratieri, how could any general, launch such a critical maneuver with such poor reconnaissance? Did they not have maps?
The sources are pretty clear on this. The maps they had were flawed, outdated, or in some cases for certain units, just non-existent. He was essentially ordering his commanders to find these tiny specific rendezvous points in a pitch-black labyrinth.
It shows a profound misunderstanding, or maybe disregard, for the ground he was operating on.
A total disregard. Any element of surprise was gone because they couldn't even find each other, let alone the enemy.
And this operational blunder, as striking as it is, it makes so much more sense when you connect it to the bigger picture, the immense political pressure he was under.
Oh, absolutely. The operational failure is only half the story. The other half is this complete abandonment of military reality, all driven by politics back in Rome.
What's so interesting here is that the sources paint Baratieri not as some reckless glory hound, but as someone who was actually reluctant. He didn't want this fight.
Not at all. He actually favored a full strategic withdrawal. His plan was to pull back, consolidate his forces, and wait for a better opportunity.
And he had good reasons, right?
Yeah.
What were his major concerns?
His reasoning was, from a purely military standpoint, irrefutable. He had catastrophic logistical problems, his supplies were dwindling, morale was in the gutter.
And his troops.
A mix. Inexperienced colonial levies called askaris alongside Italian soldiers, but many of them were equipped with outdated rifles and had very little ammunition. Communication between units was poor, and as we said, the maps were a joke. All the warning lights were flashing bright red.
So his own professional military analysis was screaming, pull back, regroup, resupply.
Yes, but that just didn't matter because the political winds from Rome were blowing like a hurricane. He was in a completely impossible position.
And the man turning the screws was the Prime Minister, Francesco Crispi.
Exactly. You have to understand. Crispi's government was on thin ice back in Italy. He desperately needed a colonial victory in East Africa to shore up his political support, to boost Italian national prestige. He needed a win.
He needed a headline.
And he didn't care what the cost was to the army on the ground.
So for Baratieri, refusing to attack would have been political suicide. It might have even brought down the government that put him there in the first place.
Precisely. The politics completely neutralized military common sense. And the sources point to one specific, just damning exchange. A telegram from Crispi to Baratieri.
What did it say?
It was brutal. It basically accused Baratieri of weakness, of cowardice. It demanded decisive action and made it clear that a glorious victory was expected immediately, even if it cost thousands of lives. Withdrawal was presented as a national disgrace.
Wow. So the strategic failure didn't begin on some mountain in Ethiopia. It began in an office in Rome.
That's it. It just shows you that battlefield disasters are so often caused by factors miles away from the front line. A political need for a victory overriding every single piece of military intelligence.
They were ordered to charge forward by a government that was completely blind to the reality, even though the general on the ground knew he was undermanned, undersupplied, and literally marching in the dark.
It's a truly painful case study in civil-military relations.
Which brings us to the execution, the actual chaotic collapse of the plan. How quickly did it all unravel?
Almost immediately. The immediate factors were environmental. The sources are full of details about the conditions. Poor visibility, sure, but it was made so much worse by a dense, disorienting mist that settled in the valleys during the night.
And in that environment, a small mistake can become a disaster.
And they made a huge one. There was a critical navigation error that just blew the whole operation wide open.
Which unit was that?
It was General Albertone's brigade holding the Italian right flank. Because of the fog, because of the bad maps, his unit completely overshot its target rendezvous point.
Okay, so they got lost.
Worse than lost. Instead of finding their defensive position to wait for the other three brigades to set up the crossfire, Albertone and his 4,000 men marched directly and completely by accident straight into the main Ethiopian camp.
Oh my God, so they weren't setting a trap.
They walked right into the lion's den.
And that one moment changes everything.
Everything. That premature accidental contact at dawn triggered the entire battle. It destroyed any last shred of hope for coordination. The planned trap just instantly shattered into 4 separate, desperate battles scattered across miles of that awful terrain.
They were fighting alone when they were supposed to be converging.
Exactly, and they were fighting an enemy that Italian intelligence had, and this is the most spectacular failure of the whole campaign, just catastrophically miscalculated.
This is the intelligence breakdown. Let's get into the numbers.
It is genuinely jaw-dropping. Italian intelligence reports suggested that Emperor Menelik II's force was maybe 30,000 troops?
30,000. And they probably assumed they were demoralized, poorly organized.
Exactly. Disunited, low on supplies, the typical colonial mindset. They thought they were facing a fairly small, fragile army.
So if 30,000 was the expectation, what was the brutal reality that Albertone's men stumbled into?
The actual mobilized Ethiopian army was a colossal force of around 100,000 troops.
100,000.
100,000. Italy underestimated the enemy by a factor of more than 3. To put it in perspective, the Italian force was outnumbered more than 6-1.
You simply cannot plan an offensive maneuver, especially not a risky night attack, when your intelligence is off by 70,000 men. That's not a mistake. That's a complete failure of the entire intelligence apparatus.
It really highlights a broader colonial arrogance, the assumption that an African power just couldn't possibly mobilize, supply, and lead such a vast and disciplined army.
And the Ethiopians, under Menelik's unified command, they knew exactly how to use that advantage.
Oh, they exploited it perfectly. They had overwhelming numbers, yes, but they also had sophisticated local knowledge of the terrain.
But Italy did have superior weaponry, right? They had modern artillery. In theory, that should have given them a massive edge. Why didn't it matter?
Because the Ethiopians didn't give them the fight they wanted. They refused to fight a pitched battle on open ground where artillery would be decisive. They used the terrain they knew intimately.
Oh, they drew them in.
They let the Italians get lost. And once those 4 brigades were scattered and isolated, the Ethiopians, with their massive numbers, simply enveloped them one by one and destroyed them in piecemeal fashion.
So the artillery was useless.
And was completely useless. The units couldn't support each other. They were often trapped in tight ravines or on steep slopes where the guns couldn't be properly deployed or even aimed effectively. The technology was nullified by terrain and numbers.
It sounds like the Ethiopians just had to wait for the Italian army to defeat itself through its own chaos, and then they just swarmed the survivors.
That's a very, very fair assessment. It was a total breakdown at every single level. The planning was bad, the execution was worse, and it was all magnified by that catastrophic intelligence failure, which was itself driven by desperate politics.
So when we look back at Adwa, to really crystallize it for the history books, the failure rests on those 2 unavoidable pillars.
I think that's right. The first pillar is purely operational. It's General Bartieri's decision to commit to that incredibly risky night march, scattering his units across unmapped terrain. That was the recipe for battlefield chaos.
And the second pillar, which is arguably even more destructive, was the strategic and political failure.
Without a doubt. The decision-making back in Rome. Ignoring every critical logistical warning, ignoring their own general's pleas because of this desperate political need for a quick victory. And doing it all while underestimating their enemy on a scale that is almost unprecedented in modern warfare.
It makes the Adwa disaster this perfect, painful case study.
It really does. It's the definitive example of how technological superiority, the artillery, the rifles, can be rendered completely irrelevant by superior preparation, local knowledge, unified command, and an intelligence failure so total that it made victory impossible from the very start.
And the implications are just massive. For you, the listener, understanding Adwa is so key to understanding the end of the 19th century. This single defeat cemented Ethiopia's independence. It made it the only African nation not successfully colonized during that brutal period we call the Scramble for Africa.
Which is monumental. It completely reshaped the history of the continent. And if you connect that defeat to the broader sweep of Italian history, it leads to a final, really provocative thought for you to explore after this. The political fallout in Rome was immediate. Prime Minister Crispi's government collapsed. But the shame of it, this stain of Adwa, it haunted the Italian political and military establishment for decades. So the question to think about is this. How did the humiliation of Adwa directly fuel Italy's geopolitical ambitions, its military planning, and its thirst for revenge in that same region in the decades that led directly to the Second World War?
That desire to erase the shame of Adwa becomes a powerful and very dangerous motivator later on. That's a fantastic question to take forward. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope you feel significantly more informed about this pivotal, chaotic moment in history.
Until next time. Welcome to the deep dive. The research you shared with us today, it really provides one of the most compelling case studies in military history.
It really does.
It's a moment that proves strategic foresight and organizational cohesion can often just trump raw technology.
And superior firepower.
Exactly. We are heading to East Africa, 1896, and diving deep into the Battle of Adwa.
This is a turning point that, it just reverberated globally. When we analyze the source material, what we're really looking at isn't just a clash of armies. It's a masterclass in exploiting information and terrain.
Right.
I mean, Italy showed up with modern artillery, quick-firing rifles, and they were decisively routed by a force that, on paper, seemed much less equipped.
Absolutely. The conventional wisdom, the whole script about colonial wars was completely flipped here. Our mission today is to take your sources and really pull out the most useful operational takeaways.
Let's do it.
We want to know, how did Emperor Menelik II, who had to integrate all these semi-autonomous regional forces, how did he manage to coordinate this massive, diverse army to achieve such a total and really a preemptive victory?
Well, that coordination is the first and perhaps the biggest hurdle Menelik overcame. It's so important to understand the scale of the challenge he was facing here.
It wasn't just one single army.
No, not at all. He wasn't just commanding one national army. He was unifying these incredibly powerful regional lords, the Raises, who, often had their own agendas, their own rivalries.
So how did he do that? I mean, we can't just say cohesion. That makes it sound too easy. Was it pure charisma, or is there a real organizational structure that backed it all up?
It was a strategic political calculation, and it was all backed by a common goal: protecting sovereignty. Menelik created a system where these regional armies, while, yes, maintaining some autonomy and pride, were unified by shared provisioning and crucially coordinated movement.
And the numbers are just staggering.
They are. The sources confirm that he successfully gathered and led a cohesive force of up to 100,000 strong. I mean, think about that. The sheer act of maintaining unity among those diverse armies, getting them to march hundreds of miles north, feeding them, and then getting them to fight as one, that was the foundation for everything that followed.
It's astonishing. And what's fascinating here is that while Menelik was solving this incredibly complex political and logistical puzzle to maintain his own internal cohesion, the Italian command structure was, well, it was doing the exact opposite.
Precisely. And that's where you see what really decided the battle before the first shot was even fired. It was the approach to information flow.
Oh, okay.
Ethiopia maintained this incredibly tight command structure, centralized under Menelik II and supported, vitally, by Empress Taytu Betul. That command was constantly fed by superior, up-to-the-minute situational awareness.
And the immediate surprise for anyone learning about this today is what they relied on for that awareness. It wasn't some advanced system.
No.
They relied on good old-fashioned runners and scouts.
That's the genius of it. This human intelligence system was perfectly suited to that specific environment. Those local runners and scouts provided consistent, reliable reports on Italian movements, their unit strength, their disposition.
And you have to think about that for a second. In the rugged, deeply segmented terrain around Adwa, where visibility is low and travel is so difficult, a human scout who knows every single gorge and trail, that's gold.
Absolutely it is. That granular localized knowledge allowed the Ethiopian forces to maintain what you could call preemptive positioning. They weren't just reacting to General Baratieri's fragmented movements, they were anticipating them. Yeah. They were setting the traps. They were deciding where the battle was going to be fought.
Okay, now let's flip to the Italian side, because the failure of their nascent technology is a huge lesson in itself. They were relying on unreliable telegraphs and notoriously poor maps.
And those systems failed spectacularly, right when they needed them most. Imagine trying to string sensitive telegraph wire across the vast high-altitude mountains of Tigray. The line was fragile, it was easily cut by local populations or, just broken by the elements.
And the maps?
The maps were even worse. They're often based on extremely outdated or, in some cases, non-existent surveys.
So Baratieri, the Italian commander, he wasn't looking at a detailed topographic chart. He was often working with what amounted to sketches or maybe unreliable information he got from local guides who knows what their incentives were.
Which is exactly why this situation just devolved into disaster in the days leading up to the battle. Amid the mist and the complex, unfamiliar terrain of Adwa, their communications completely broke down.
Utterly.
And the sources are clear on the immediate fatal impact. Because Baratieri couldn't coordinate his movements or even confirm the enemy's location, he was forced into this desperate, fragmented night advance.
A night advance that was chaotic from the absolute start. And this is how the Italian army, instead of moving as a coordinated whole, just fractured into these isolated, vulnerable columns.
Exactly. This one decision left specific brigades, most famously General Albertone's column, completely exposed. They were detached from the main Italian line, walking straight into the jaws of the main Ethiopian force because their commander couldn't receive updated orders or coordinate with the neighboring brigades who were miles away, bogged down by the terrain.
The ultimate lesson here really seems to be that technology is worthless if the organizational structure and the operational environment can't support it.
That's it.
Ethiopia had trusted, high quality, maybe slow, but localized information. Italy had fast but unreliable and non-localized technology. The quality of the information, not the medium, decided that whole initial phase of the battle.
That is the takeaway. The decentralized human system proved robust and reliable in that specific operational environment, whereas the cutting-edge telegraph was just fragile and brittle.
Okay, so let's unpack the battle itself. How did that centralized intelligence and that organizational cohesion, how did that translate into tactical annihilation on the ground?
It translated into highly coordinated maneuvers, and they were executed with just stunning precision. The Ethiopian forces used their superior positioning to execute simultaneous assaults on those already separated Italian columns.
So Albertone's column, for instance, which was so dangerously isolated, it wasn't just hit by one flank, it was enveloped.
Absolutely, enveloped. And this is where the superior local knowledge became the force multiplier. The Ethiopian commanders, they knew every pass, every hidden approach, every patch of high ground.
Right.
This knowledge allowed them to channel the enemies who were already confused and disoriented by the terrain and the morning mist into what were essentially predetermined kill zones. The Italian plan for a surprise attack was instantly turned into a series of piecemeal annihilations as these isolated columns were surrounded and just overwhelmed before they could ever link up.
That's classic military strategy, using the ground itself as a weapon. But that kind of tactical execution requires more than just local knowledge. It requires foresight, and it requires resource management, especially when you have such a massive force. We have to talk about the reserves.
Yes, this is such a crucial strategic point, and it's often overlooked. Despite having overwhelming numbers, 100,000 men on the field, the Ethiopian command showed immense restraint. They held back massive reserves for exploitation. That's a key principle of war that's so often ignored by commanders who get overconfident.
Or who fear the enemy will just run away.
Exactly.
And the sources you provided, they give a specific example of this. They named the powerful contingent of Ras Makronen's troops. These were fresh, powerful forces held back, sometimes miles away from the initial fighting.
And that ability to commit powerful, fresh forces once the enemy is already engaged, exhausted, and in chaos, it's fundamentally decisive. It breaks the enemy's will to fight. They think they've overcome the worst, and then suddenly they're facing a completely new, unspent army. It just maximized the damage from the initial fragmentation.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the coordination and foresight, it extended well beyond the immediate field of battle. We can't discuss the strategic preparations without highlighting Empress Taytu Betul's oversight. The sources confirm it was critical.
Her actions demonstrate that victory is often won in the lead-up, sometimes without firing a single shot. The sources point to her earlier implementation of logistical denial.
The water supplies.
Specifically cutting Italian water supplies along their expected advance routes.
That is such a ruthless, brilliant move. I mean, imagine being an Italian private soldier realizing not only are you marching into chaos and unfamiliar territory, but you're already rationing the last drops in your canteen. What was the impact of that?
It was psychological warfare and strategic incapacitation all rolled into one. It disrupted Italian cohesion, and it leveraged environmental factors before there was even major contact. An army that is dehydrated is an army that is demoralized, it's slow, it's less likely to execute complex maneuvers.
So they were already suffering.
It means the Italian forces were already suffering from a non-combat casualty dehydration and low morale before the first shot was ever fired in anger.
So logistics became the first casualty of the war for the Italians. And the Ethiopian Unified Command, they used every single tool available, from the runners to the water denial to stack the deck.
It was a perfect storm of preparedness meeting unpreparedness. Menelik II and his commanders, they leveraged what they had: terrain, local knowledge, robust internal communication against an adversary that was arrogant enough to believe that technology alone could conquer geography and superior organization.
So what does this all mean for us? For the learner diving into this history, this wasn't just a victory of superior numbers. It was fundamentally a triumph of organizational design.
And decentralized execution, intelligence management.
Yes. Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
Adwa really offers three key operational takeaways that, they transcend military history. They apply to any complex, high-stakes endeavor you might undertake.
Okay, give us the synthesis. Break it down for us.
Number one, unity of command. The necessary foundation for success was that integration of all those diverse regional armies into a single, cohesive 100,000 unit. Fragmentation kills efficiency. Cohesion delivers maximum impact. When you're confronting a major challenge, internal division is your greatest vulnerability.
Okay, number two.
Number two, information quality over speed. The sources make it crystal clear that reliable, localized, trusted intelligence delivered by human networks beat the unreliable, distant communication of those nascent telegraphs and faulty maps. Trusted, quality sources and systems that are robust to environmental stress. They matter more than the instantaneous speed of delivery.
I think that's a lesson we are still learning today.
We are. And finally, number 3, exploitation and reserves. The victory wasn't just about showing up. It was about maximizing the advantage you've gained. And that meant the combination of coordinated development, leveraging superior local knowledge, and the decisive, planned use of massive, unspent reserves to turn the tide and just crush the enemy's will.
So ultimately, the Adwa victory was about exploiting every single available advantaged terrain, local knowledge, logistics, superior internal communication against an adversary that was just fundamentally hampered by its own disjointed command and fatally flawed information system.
Exactly. They won by focusing on what they could control and what their opponent couldn't manage.
It's a timeless lesson in resource allocation, clear decision-making, and adapting your information system to the reality of the environment, not just, relying blindly on the newest gadgetry.
That's it in a nutshell.
Thank you for sharing these powerful sources with us. We really hope these nuggets of knowledge about command structure and intelligence quality stick with you.
This whole thing raises an important question for all of us today. In our modern world, where we rely instantly on fragmented, often flawed, global digital information, where social media creates this endless situational awareness but very little reliable context, are we building information systems more like the centralized, well-informed, real-time command of Menelik II? Or are we, maybe unknowingly, the unsupported, poorly mapped brigade of Albertone, depending on complex, fragile systems that are guaranteed to fail us when the terrain gets foggy? Or when the pressure is highest?
The power of coordination and trusted local intelligence, that remains the constant, regardless of the century. We'll see you on the next deep dive.